Hi, I'm Paul Marston. This is the third of 4 talks given over the Easter period on behalf of King's Church, Pemberton Free Methodist Church. We've looked at Simon Peter and Caiaphas. This week we're going to look at Pilate, and the final week I'm going to look at how the resurrection accounts, the various resurrection accounts, fit together. So I'm just going to go now to hopefully put up the screen. Okay, well, first of all, what sources do we have to know about Pilate? And I'll begin with ones that we know are authentic early sources. The 4 Gospels all refer to Pilate, and Matthew also refers to his wife, but without naming her. There's no general agreement on their dating, but 45 to 70 AD seems about right. Then there's Philo, who was a devout Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jew living in Alexandria, great centre of philosophy and thinking in the ancient world. A great philosopher and thinker, he gives a very hostile picture of Pilate in an incident that Pilate had with the Jewish people. Josephus was of priestly origins, a clever scholar and politician. He led a group of Jewish forces against Rome early in the War of 66 AD. Arrested around 67 AD, he changed sides and tried to negotiate with the Jews defending Jerusalem on behalf of the Romans. Josephus had predicted that Vespasian would become emperor, and when he did, Vespasian regarded him as a kind of prophet. 71, Josephus went to Rome and became a Roman citizen. He remained, though, an observant Jew and remarried several times, but each time with a Jewess. Josephus explicitly claims to be writing objective history and neither Jewish nor Roman propaganda. His 2 big works, the Wars about 75 AD and the Antiquities about 94 AD, give a consistent picture of Pilate. The final one mentioned, Tacitus, the Roman historian, just gives a passing mention to the fact that Christ was executed by Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Okay, some early church sources. Ignatius, these are most other sources are later, like these, or dodgy, or both. So Ignatius writes that on the day of preparation, Jesus receives sentence from Pilate, the Father permitting that to happen. He really adds nothing new apart from that. Justin Martyr refers in passing twice to the then supposedly extant Acts of Pilate as backup of the facts surrounding Jesus' trial as he's making his apology, trying to defend the faith. Tertullian makes a similar point around the same time. Tertullian in his apology wrote that Pilate, who in his conscience was a Christian, sent Tiberius Caesar an account of all these proceedings relating to Christ. Doesn't actually say he was a Christian, in his conscience was a Christian, and he says that he sent the Acts of Pilate, but of course we don't have that original Acts of Pilate. Origen, a bit later, in his work against the critic Celsius, notes that it was not so much Pilate that condemned him, but the Jews who have since been punished and dispersed by God. The argument, of course, is if Pilate did all this to Jesus, why hasn't God punished Pilate? And Origen says, well, it's because he wasn't really all that to blame. It was the Jews and they have been punished. Origen also notes that Pilate's wife had a vision and sent a message. It doesn't actually say in the Bible it was a vision, it says it was a dream, but anyway. He doesn't here name her, Origen, but he's really replying to Celsus, saying that, well, Pilate wasn't all that guilty, really. Now, it's said that in his homilies on Matthew 35, that Pilate's wife was called Procurator and became a Christian, but I haven't been able to find that actual reference. I've seen several secondary references to it, so it may well be there. So those are the early fathers or the patristic writings. Then there's a big but late source, the Acts of Pilate, which is in the Gospel of Nicodemus. Now, this is the largest apocryphal, that is non-biblical source, and Earlier writers like Justin Martyr had said there was an Acts of Pilate, but we don't have a copy of it. And this actual document is first referred to by someone called Epiphanius in approximately 376 AD, so it is 4th century. It was clearly not written by Nicodemus or Pilate. Parts of it are fanciful. For example, the Roman standards bow down of their own accord to Jesus. Parts show its much later origins. For example, it refers to Mary as the Mother of God, which early fathers don't do. And parts seem a rather fanciful embroidery of Pilate's innocence with ever more extreme sort of circumlocutions that he tries to make to get out and make a decision. But quite a lot of it contains narrative which closely parallels the Gospels. Within this, there are a few interesting additions or divergences which may embody some genuine traditions. And I note that after all, John says in 21:25, there are many more things that Jesus did. If all of them were written down, I suppose not even the world itself would have space for the books that would be written. So who is to say that some of these things weren't preserved in different church traditions? The book as a whole is a forgery, but maybe it has in it a few elements of remembered sayings preserved in the church tradition in which this overall forgery was put together. Okay, what about the background of procurators? They lived in a palace in Caesarea. That's a rather pleasant coastal Greco-Roman town and fortress built by Herod the Great. This is where the procurators lived in what the Romans called Palestine. And it's about 120 kilometers northwest from Jerusalem. This is some of its ruins, which are still there, and some of its plan, which was built by Herod, and it was really quite a palatial palace, if you'll pardon the expression. In 1961, a stone was found in Caesarea, which has this writing on it. It's got part of Pontius Pilate, and it's got part of prefect in Judea. And so the title prefect meant he was an equestrian, not from the highest rank, the nobility in Roman society. So we know that about him. Until then, some people doubted he even existed, because you always get some clever dick scholars that say, oh, Josephus and the Bible got it all wrong. But that was the first indication. There are also coins that he minted, but they don't have his image on them. So we haven't a great deal of physical remains, if you like. Okay, the name Pontius shows he was probably from the Samite Ponti family, which produced some important figures. His name, Pilatus, Romans all had three names. This bit, Pilatus, may mean skilled with a javelin, which could have been either earned by him or his father. Now, Augustus had set rules that equestrians had to have had a military command before becoming a prefect, so we can assume that he had had some military command. There are different legends, but we don't actually know where that was. He was appointed in 26 AD, and in theory, his line manager, if you like to put it like that, was the Syrian legate, but the post was empty. It had been filled by 36 AD, when the legate Vitellius dismissed him. As governor, he was military commander, head of the judicial system, and was responsible for collecting tributes and taxes and for dispersing funds, including the minting of coins. This is the back and front of a coin which was minted during his time as procurator. Often, though, although the procurator was chief judge, the Romans left local systems in place, except where accusations, of course, were made against Roman citizens who could, as Paul later did, appeal to Caesar if they wanted to. According to both Josephus' works, Pilate one night moved imperial standards, this is before Jesus' execution, moved imperial standards with Caesar's image into Jerusalem. Now, the Jews were very fanatical about their holy city. No images were supposed to be in there. And a crowd of Jews surrounded his house in Caesarea. That's where they generally live in Jerusalem. And for 5 days they surrounded his house. Then Pilate summoned them to an arena where he had Roman soldiers go right round the outside of the crowd, and they drew their swords, and he threatened to execute them. But the Jews showed so little fear of death, they threw themselves down and bared their necks and said, well, kill us, we'd rather die, that Pilate actually gave in and he removed the standards. So that was one incident. And then, according to both of Josephus' works, again, there's a second incident as well. And in this, the offence was that he'd used temple money, which was korbanos, to pay for a new aqueduct to Jerusalem. When a mob formed while he was visiting Jerusalem, he again ordered his troops, but this time he told them not to use swords, but they were to conceal clubs and to start beating up the people. The mob was dispersed, but a number did die from the blows. So this again was a cause of complaint. This is the remains of that aqueduct. Philo records what seems to be a different and final incident. Pilate removes some inscribed gold shields to Herod's Jerusalem palace. The sons of Herod the Great petitioned him to remove the shields, but he refused. This would include Herod Antipas, presumably. Pilate refused, and they then petitioned the Emperor Tiberius, who rather angrily reprimanded Pilate, ordering him to remove the shields. So 3 incidents. There may have been others. Jesus mentioned something about Galileans' blood being mingled with their sacrifices. It might be one of the same issues. Okay, so his background before the execution of Jesus was that he'd had a number of bad interactions with Jewish people, not shown a great deal of sensitivity to their particular beliefs and their sensitivities, and had complaints made about him to the emperor. Okay, so let's come to the time of Jesus and his arrest. It's a couple of days before the Jewish Passover. During the Passover time, the Jerusalem population will swell to over 2 million. These will be volatile, excited, fanatical pilgrims. Pilate leaves Caesarea at the head of a strong show of force. Soldiers going to the Antonia fortress. He himself may have stayed at Herod's palace, but this is a strong show of force. The Romans tended to do that. They wanted a strong show of force to stop people from becoming awkward or rioting or having a revolution. It's interesting that the other side of the city, a man who you may know about, makes a triumphal entry, but not riding a war horse, but on a donkey. I guess you know who that is. Okay, bit of a contrast. Moving on then, a couple of days later, it's now evening on the Jewish day of preparation. Of course, there have been a few disturbances going on in Jerusalem in the last few days. Well, that was pretty normal at Passover, but there hadn't been anything that got out of hand. But it's the Jewish day of preparation. Tomorrow, the Passover lambs will be killed, ready for Passover itself that evening, when all the Jewish people will eat the Passover. But then, in the early evening, a message comes from the high priest Caiaphas. Early tomorrow, Your Excellency, we will bring a man to you, a rabble-rouser. We want you to judge him and execute him. Do it quick to avoid trouble. So Pilate agrees. Now, Caiaphas was a young but clever man, and Pilate had left him in post for some 5 years. Generally, they worked well together, apart from a few incidents already mentioned. It was in both their interest to avoid any trouble that might bring Roman censure of Pilate or retribution on the Jews, or both. And by the way, it's interesting, the leading commentator on Matthew, R.T. France, shares my belief that Pilate had been contacted the previous night before the trial took place. Pilate's wife, presumably when he goes back in for a game of Scrabble or whatever they did in Roman households, asks him what the embassy is about, and we can assume that he tells her. The wife, whom some sources call Procurator, and I'm going to call her that for convenience, is interested in Jewish faith. Some later Christian sources suggest she was a God-fearer, worshipping the Jewish God. I'll mention that again later. Maybe she's heard about this Jesus. Maybe she talked to Herod's steward Chusa, who was also at Herod's palace. Maybe she'd even gone secretly to hear Jesus. We just don't know. But she's concerned and shares some doubts with him. He is the prefect, ultimate judge. Surely he's going to try the case properly. He's not just going to rubber stamp it. So, well, maybe he agreed, maybe he didn't with his wife. But the next morning, they brought Jesus from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's residence. It was very early morning. This is, of course, quotation from the Bible. They did not go into the governor's residence, so they would not be ceremonially defiled, but could eat the Passover meal, which, as I keep saying, was not the night before, but was that night. So Pilate came outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Well, actually, that's the natural thing for any judge to say. But they get a shock. He says, "What's the charge?" And their answers are all over the place. "We wouldn't have brought him unless he was guilty." Can you imagine any prosecution lawyer saying this in a trial? Well, if he wasn't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him. And that's what they said. Well, Pilate told them, Pilate told them, "Take him yourselves and pass judgment on him according to your own law." And the Jewish leaders replied, "We cannot legally put anyone to death." This happened to fulfill the word Jesus had spoken when he indicated what kind of death he was going to die. There's a big question, which I am going to answer. Was it the Roman or Jewish law that prevented them trying and executing Jesus? I've repeatedly argued that it was not the Roman law, but the Jewish court could not try and convict on the Jewish day of preparation, and that's what stopped them from trying and executing Jesus. So Jesus' prophecy was remarkable because everyone knew he was not an insurrectionist against Rome, and so Rome would be unlikely to try him. And if he was tried for blasphemy, the Jewish court would not crucify him, they would stone him. That's why it was to fulfill this prophecy. It really was a prophecy. Okay, well, I've gone into a few more reasons about believing the Sanhedrin could have executed him, except for the day that they arrested him. As I will remind you, they had decided, and I said this last week, and it's in the Bible, not to arrest him during the feast because it could cause a riot. So they were going to wait. And then Judas went to Caiaphas or his agents and said, "Look, Jesus is not going to resist arrest, and I know where he's going to be, and you can arrest him tonight, and it will all be done quietly, and nobody will start a riot." And so it was because of that that Caiaphas had sent this message to Pilate the night before saying, "Get ready, we're going to bring you somebody who want you to execute him." Okay, why do I think that they did have normally the right to try and execute people? Well, firstly, in Acts 7, very shortly later, the same Caiaphas presided over the trial and execution of Stephen. It looks like a regular trial, and the witnesses laid their garments at the feet of one called Saul of Tarsus. Later in Acts 26:10, Paul says, "I not only shut up many of the saints in prison by authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them." Now, this was a time when Caiaphas was still high priest, and Paul, it seems, although he doesn't seem to have been around when Jesus was arrested, he was in Jerusalem, apparently on the Sanhedrin. He was, after all, a rising scholar and protege of the great Rabbi Gamaliel. And Paul voted for executions. Now, how could he do this if they didn't have the power to execute anyone anyway? It doesn't make sense. As a backup from a non-biblical source, the Acts of Pilate has some interesting bits in it. The Jews say to Pilate, "Our law here bears that a man who wrongs fellow man is worthy to receive 39 lashes, but he that blasphemes God is to be stoned with stone." And Pilate says to him, "Well, do you take him and punish him whatever way you please?" Pilate would hardly have said this if it was illegal for them to do it. He's saying, "Well, you can stone him, go and stone him." And why can't they do it? Well, because also in the Acts of Pilate, Pilate witheringly says, "Well, your God won't let you execute him, but you want me to." God won't let them execute him because it's their day of preparation, but you want me to do it. The simple fact is that they could not execute Jesus at that time because it was illegal to hold a Jewish trial either at night or, for that matter, on the day of preparation. It wasn't Roman rules, but it was their own rules which stopped them. Anyway, they are all a bit at 7. They expected him to rubber stamp the execution, but now they begin to accuse him, saying, "We found this man subverting our nation, forbidding us to pay the tribute tax to Caesar and claiming he himself is Christ the King." Okay, so here's something that Pilate can work on, can look at. A Messiah claiming to be king would indeed be an enemy of Rome. So John says Pilate went back to the governor's residence, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This will be private. Remember, they won't go into the praetorium or any Gentile residence at this time because they would defile themselves and be unable to eat the Passover. So this is a private conversation. Jesus replies, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or have others told you about me?" Pilate answered, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own people and your chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish authorities. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Jesus had exercised his right to remain silent in Jewish courts, but now he's in a Roman one, and he replies to Pilate. Some later Roman governors in the Acts were similarly rather contemptuous when asked to judge on Jewish matters. It's now pretty obvious to Pilate, though, that his wife was right. This man is no revolutionary insurrectionist, but what does Jesus mean by being a king? So he goes on questioning him. "So you are a king?" Jesus replied, "You said it." Well, that means yes, but you say I'm a king. For this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. And then Pilate asks, "What is truth?" It's a very famous question, often used in sermons. Is this actually how it was left? A sardonic rhetorical question, or rather cynical, well, what is truth? Well, the Acts of Pilate has a very interesting addition. In the Acts of Pilate, Pilate says it has a lot similar conversation to that point. Pilate says, "What is the truth?" Jesus answered, "The truth is from the heavens, or from heaven." Pilate says, "On earth then, is there no truth?" Christ says, "I am the truth." And how is the truth judged on earth? By those who have earthly power. Now, obviously that reply is not in the contemporary gospel accounts. You can think it's a complete fiction. That's your prerogative. But as I've said, John 21 does tell us, well, God said other things. Jesus said other things that are not written in the books. Are we to believe that no clever responses of the Saviour could be remembered and treasured outside the Gospels? Well, my personal belief is that there's a good chance Jesus actually did reply like this. If he didn't, I do wonder what other genius could think of such reply. Remember the kind of replies that he gave when he was asked about the tribute money, and when he was asked about the resurrection, and he was asked about other things. He answered them very cleverly. When the woman was taken to him, he'd been caught in adultery, and he said, "All right, well, the one of you that hasn't got any guilt, you cast the first stone." This is the kind of thing that we would expect Jesus to say, and so I think that there's a good chance that that will be something he actually said. Anyway, whether he said that or not, Pilate goes back out and says to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man. He's not a revolutionary." But they persist in saying he incites the people by teaching throughout all Judea. It started in Galilee and ended up here. Now, when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. When he heard that he was from Herod's jurisdiction, Herod Antipas, he sent him over to Herod also. Well, he didn't happen to be in Jerusalem, that's what Gospel writer says, but he was there for the Passover. In fact, he would have been in the palace next door, probably where Pilate was staying. And Pilate had fallen out with Herod a bit over the shields that he tried to bring into the palace. But now it's a kind of placatory, well, it's a combination. It's a placatory gesture, but it's also a way of Pilate getting out of doing any judgment and going back and telling his wife, "Darling, I've got good news. I didn't have to condemn him. Herod's done it." Well, he goes to Herod, but Herod doesn't even deign to reply to Herod, who just wants to see some magic tricks. So back he comes to Pilate. Next, Pilate tries to release Jesus based on some tradition of Passover. We don't know what it was. Maybe he'd invented it. Of clemency and pardon. Shall I release Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, or Jesus Barabbas, which means Jesus the Son of the Father? Barabbas is a strange name. Was that really his name, or was that a nickname because he wanted to stay anonymous? Don't know. But anyway, that was the question. At this point, or somewhere around here, Matthew's a bit vague about the exact timing, but as he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message to him: have nothing to do with that innocent man. I suffered greatly as a result of a dream about him today. Now, later Christians speak of a vision, an angelic vision given Procula, but it doesn't say that. It just simply said she's had nightmares. Well, I think that she'd warned her husband the previous evening. She'd been uneasy. She'd gone to sleep and had a restless night of nightmares. I wonder if any of you have had that. Finally, waking up, she sends him this message. This is perfectly natural and plausible. So why some clever commentators say they don't really think this could have happened, I've no idea. It sounds very human and very plausible to me. Okay, well, Jesus has been flogged and had a crown of thorns, but still the rebel cry out, crucify him, crucify him. They shout out, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said, you take him and crucify him. So I don't find any reason for an accusation against him. And they reply again, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now, so I keep saying, Pilate wouldn't have told them to do it if it was illegal, but they couldn't. It was a day of preparation. So it was their own laws that stopped them, but they couldn't do it. And when he heard what they said, remember what they just said is he claimed to be a son of God. When Pilate heard that, well, maybe he was not a religious man, but was a bit superstitious. His wife had warned him not to condemn Jesus. Now the Jews were saying he claimed to be a son of God. So he goes back into the governor's residence and says to Jesus, where do you come from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know I have the authority to release you and crucify you? Jesus said, you would have no authority over me at all unless it was given to you by above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of greater sin. Pilate is astounded that Jesus knows full well the powers that Pilate has, but he's not going to answer him. He's not going to make a passionate defense and say, well, really, you ought to let me go. And Jesus reminded him that all the power ultimately comes from God. So John says from this point on, he wished to and tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders kept crying out, if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. So Pilate, in the end, Matthew tells us, publicly washes his hands. The Jewish people say, upon us and our children be his blood. But of course, it's still the Roman soldiers that crucify him. It isn't the Jews. So he orders him to be crucified, and he's taken out and crucified on the place of the skull between the two malefactors, as they're quaintly called in the old Bibles, wrongdoers. Pilate also had a notice written and fastened to the cross which read, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Thus many of the Jewish residents of Jerusalem read this notice because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the notice was written in Aramaic, Latin and Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man said I am King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. What was in Pilate's mind in doing this? Well, a lot of people in Jerusalem for the Passover would read this notice. Was it to discourage rebellion and say, it's what happens if you rebel against Rome? Or was it to spite the Jewish leaders who'd forced him to execute Jesus, to say, okay, you want me to do that, then this is all you're worth? Who can be sure? I don't know. It's in 3 Gospels, but at most length in John. It may be that John wants us to note that he's already told us that the religious leader of the Jews, official religious leader Caiaphas, had proclaimed that Jesus would die for the people. He'd also said, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. So he's proclaimed who Jesus is in religious terms. And now the political leader of that place has acknowledged that Jesus is the King of the Jews, and therefore therefore, in a sense, the king of all, at least in their thinking. So the Bible tells us that it was the day of the preparation, and the Passover would be eaten, sorry about the spelling, that evening, and the three bodies should not remain on the crosses. Joseph of Arimathea obtains Pilate's permission to take Jesus' body, and with Nicodemus quickly puts it into a nearby tomb. So Mark says, now when evening had already come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, the day before Passover, Joseph of Arimathea, a highly regarded member of the council, who was himself looking forward to the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And then John tells us that Nicodemus, also a highly regarded member of the council, helped. Nicodemus, of course, originally came to talk with Jesus at night, and people often assume this is because he was nervous or scared, rather than, seems at least as likely to me, he just wanted a quiet private chat to Jesus, and he couldn't get one during the day. But these two men risked a lot when Jesus' close followers had run away, and both, of course, were now ceremonially defiled, and they would not be able to eat the Passover that evening. But they were the people that stood by Jesus. Okay, in a final scene, the Jewish authorities remember that Jesus said he would rise again. So Pilate is persuaded to set a Roman guard on the tomb. Roman guard knew, of course, if they failed in their duty, they would be executed without hesitation. Later, the angel arrives, makes the guards faint, and then when they wake up, they see that the doors of the tombs roll back and they run away. Well, the Jewish leaders say, spread the story that the disciples stole the body, and we'll make it all right with Pilate. Whether they could, I don't know. But obviously it's an absurd story. How could the sound of a huge slab being rolled back not wake them up? What really happened, we will look at next week. What later became of Pilate? Well, he plays no part in the trial and execution of Stephen and others by Caiaphas and also by Saul of Tarsus. Josephus tells us that in 36 AD, his heavy-handed treatment in killing some Samaritans led the Syrian legate to dismiss him and send him to Rome for trial by Tiberius Caesar. Before he got there, Tiberius died. And Josephus doesn't tell us what happened to Pilate. Was he released? Was he tried? Was he acquitted? Did he get another post? We're not told. There are stories and legends. One early legend reported reasonably early, 320 AD by Eusebius, was that Caligula, the new emperor, ordered him to commit suicide. Western traditions have portrayed him, Christian traditions have portrayed him as various degrees of villain. Eastern Christian traditions saw him and his wife as becoming Christians. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, they were even saints. Part of the issue concerned the arguments by people like the anti-Christian Celsus that surely God would have punished Pilate for executing Jesus. So, as I said, Origen argues that Pilate was not really to blame, and maybe his wife became a Christian. Eusebius takes the other route. Pilate was punished by dying in disgrace by having to commit suicide. Well, we don't know exactly what happened to Pilate, but there are some reactions which we can be sure are wrong. The first is that some, as I've mentioned, rather clever commentators, loads of them that come in and put their opinions forth as though they're modern scholarship, have suggested one or both of the first two here. To me, the Pilate in Josephus, the Gospels and Philo is reasonably consistent insofar as he is not consistent. He's pig-headed, so he says, what I have written, I've written. He hesitates to actually cause a riot or massacre, backs off from keeping the standards there and killing all the Jews, being nervous of the reaction of his masters in Rome. All of that, to me, fits pretty well with the Pilate in the Gospels. Also, the Gospel picture is, well, the church didn't make it up to exonerate Pilate. It's hardly flattering, is it? Here is the all-powerful Roman governor, the prefect, the procurator, who pronounces a man innocent and then executes him because of fear of a non-Roman mob. It's not normal for judges to pronounce somebody innocent, then have them flogged, and then have them crucified. Well, they might do it in some countries, but really, that's very unusual. And that's exactly what he did. It's not very flattering. The third is the most terrible reaction. And this is that the Jews are somehow guilty and it's okay for the church to persecute them. They're sometimes being called Christ killers and all sorts of other silly names, really. Jesus and his disciples, we remember, were Jewish. Excuse me. Jesus himself told his followers to love his enemies, their enemies, and as he was about to be crucified, said, "Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing." But the institutional church's reaction through much of history has been terrible, absolutely terrible. As I've said, Jesus and all his disciples were Jewish. Martin Luther, having failed to convert Jews in his day, wrote some of the most anti-Semitic works in history. He laid out in detail the activities finally launched by Hitler in the terrible Kristallnacht, I can't pronounce it, in November 1938. And Hitler's satanic anti-Semitic movement got support from some or many Catholics and Lutherans, particularly the Lutherans, because of Martin Luther's own laying the foundations. It's not the only incident, of course. There were many other incidents of anti-Semitism in the Christian, in institutional church history, including in our own country, but this is perhaps the worst example of it. And all that kind of thing is completely wrong. Paul said we should try to have such a blessing in the church that all the Jews get jealous and get converted. Well, we've been a long way from doing that, rather sadly, for the last 2,000 years. Okay, what are we to make from the theory of Pilate? What are we to make of Pilate himself? He was a person not prepared to suffer personal loss for his own convictions. He realised soon on that Jesus was no anti-Roman revolutionary. Within the first few sentences, he realised that. He pronounced him innocent and then had him flogged and crucified. Now, Caiaphas' motives may well have been mixed, but he probably really did think he was protecting the Jewish people and the temple of God from Roman wrath. Pilate was torn really between two fears. He had the fear of consequences if he executed a righteous man of spiritual power, a kind of son of God. And on the other hand, the fear of Roman consequence if the Jews rioted or reported him for disloyalty to Caesar. Well, sadly, in our own times, we've seen recently how even some leading politicians professing a strong faith can go along with a big lie, because if they don't, it will harm their careers. I'll leave you to work it out who I'm talking about. God may not generally be on the side of one political party or another, but surely he supports truth. Usually political parties, with the exception of Hitler's, have good and bad points in what they want to do. But surely God supports important truths, if there are truths. For most of us, though, anything like this can happen at a much lower level. We can have a clash between sticking to our Christian principles, or which, if we do, we can have a harm to our career or our standing. And that can happen. Will we stand up for our convictions? Pilate is an extreme example of a politician who didn't. Then there's another question: can someone just wash their hands? It was showy, but it didn't really convince anybody, because it was Pilate himself who in the end ordered the execution. The Jewish people didn't. They asked him to do it, but he ordered the soldiers to crucify him, to flog him and to crucify him. He had the responsibility. Just washing your hands and saying nothing to do with me doesn't remove that. Finally, did Pilate ever repent and become a Christian? Well, again, to be honest, we simply do not know. It's entirely possible that a mid-ranking Roman lady will become a God-fearer, as the businesswoman Lydia did later, when Paul reached Philippi. As I mentioned, Proculator may have talked with Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, and Joanna later saw the risen Christ. In the Acts of Pilate, Pilate himself declares that his wife was a God-fearer. And Josephus declares, by the way, that Nero's wife Poppaea was a God-fearer. And some believe she became a Christian before Nero executed her. So we don't know. Maybe Proculator had more success with Pilate than Poppaea did with Nero. So maybe even both of them became Christians. What we do know is that Jesus told Paul that Paul was persecuting him. Why are you persecuting me? As he persecuted Christians, because they're the body of Christ. And Paul believed it had made him the chief of sinners. God forgave and transformed Saul into apostle. Why not for Pilate and his wife? What we do know is that the grace of God and the achievement of the death of Jesus the Messiah made it possible for anyone, however deep their sin, to become Christians. So let's hope that both Proculator and Pilate in the end did become Christians, as at least some of the legends say. So thank you for listening, and hope that you can join me another week when I will be talking next week about the way. Next week I'll be talking about the way in which the resurrection accounts fit together. People have often said they're contradictory. They actually aren't. If you get into the context, they all fit very well. So we'll have a look at that next week, and I hope you join me then.